Let me say this clearly. No one in our family ever heard anything about Elvis having bone cancer.
Graceland did not feel like a normal house, even on quiet days. It sat on the hill like a private world, but it breathed like a public building. Phones rang with business that never slept. Cars eased up to the gates at all hours, some invited, some not. At the center of it all was one man who could not move without the world wanting to know where he was, what he felt, what he might be hiding. For people on the outside, Graceland looked like a sanctuary. For the people living inside it, it often felt like a fortress with thin walls. Every conversation carried risk. Every new face meant one more person who might speak when they were supposed to stay silent. Fame had given Elvis Presley more than any singer of his time, but it had also taken something that never came back. It had taken the right to keep a simple secret. Inside the house, regular life tried to keep going. Family meals, small jokes in the kitchen, late-night laughter drifting down the hallway. Someone would be tuning a guitar while someone else flipped channels on the television. But even in those soft moments, there was a sense that the air itself could not be trusted. A sentence spoken in the den could somehow reappear later in a magazine paragraph, twisted just enough to sting. That was the rhythm of life, when the world believed it had a claim on your private moments. People did not always leak stories because they were cruel. Some were excited to share what they had seen. Others wanted to seem important. A few needed money. There were staff members, acquaintances, distant relatives, friends of friends, all moving in and out of that circle around Elvis. Each person came with their own reasons, their own loyalties, their own limits. The result was simple. Very little stayed only inside Graceland. Something almost always slipped. It did not take long for Elvis's family to understand that trust could not be offered lightly. Vernon Presley in particular felt the weight of that lesson. He was not only Elvis's father. He was the man who watched the bills, handled the practical details, and tried to hold the gates closed while the world kept pushing against them. To many people, he looked stern, even hard. Inside the family, his protectiveness could feel almost fierce. Vernon saw what the gossip did. He saw how a quiet moment could be turned into something jagged and cruel once it left the house. He saw the way rumors grew a second and third life after they moved beyond the property line. A small comment from a tired night could become a headline suggesting scandal, crisis, or weakness. The more it happened, the less he was willing to leave trust to chance. So he began to test it. Sometimes that meant sharing a small piece of information with one person and nowhere else. Sometimes it meant saying something slightly dramatic in a tight circle and then waiting to see if it would echo outside. The method was simple but effective. If words he had spoken in confidence appeared later in a newspaper or an interview, he knew exactly where they had come from. The house may have had thin walls, but he was determined to at least know which cracks were letting the wind in. Around Elvis, the same instinct existed in a quieter way. He had always been playful. He knew how to surprise a room, how to shift the mood with a single remark. Over time, that sense of theater took on another purpose. He might drop a striking comment, something that made people stop for a moment, and then pay attention to who repeated it later. He was not doing it to trick people for sport. He was trying to find out who was safe. When your life becomes a target, trust becomes a kind of survival skill. Elvis had seen how quickly people sold stories. He watched friendships bend under the pressure of money, fame, and access. It was not paranoia for its own sake. It was a response to a pattern he could not ignore. The more famous he became, the more dangerous loose talk felt. In that world, the line between real events and spoken tests started to blur. A sentence did not always reflect a true condition. Sometimes it was a tool. A word could be chosen not because it described reality, but because it carried enough weight that no one would forget hearing it. If that word appeared later in the wrong place, the source had revealed themselves. It was a harsh way to live, but for a family that had seen private pain turned into public entertainment, it seemed necessary. The people closest to Elvis understood this unwritten game. They knew that certain things said in certain moments might never have been meant as literal truth. They were signals. Marcus Vernon and Elvis used to trace the path of gossip slipping outside the gates. Still, not everyone caught the difference. A statement spoken once, as a test, could land on someone who heard it as absolute fact. At the same time, the atmosphere inside Graceland was growing heavier. Elvis was dealing with real health issues, a demanding schedule, and the constant expectation that he remain larger than life. There were doctor visits, prescriptions, and days when pain or exhaustion settled over him like a weight. Those parts were very real. They were not rumors or planted stories. They were the private reality of a man the world expected to be unbreakable. To those watching from the inside, it sometimes felt like two different lives were running on top of each other. There was the life the public thought they understood, built from headlines, gossip, and dramatic claims. Then there was the quieter truth, built from long nights, family worries, and private conversations behind closed doors. The trouble was that the outside version always seemed to run faster. It spread in days, while the truth often moved at the slow pace of direct experience. That is the soil in which a rumor like bone cancer could take root, not because doctors had spoken it, not because the family had lived with that diagnosis, but because dramatic words had occasionally been used inside the house for another purpose entirely. When you live in a place where certain phrases are released like colored smoke to track where the air carries them, you accept a strange risk. One of those phrases might drift farther than you ever meant it to go. From the outside, fans only saw the final shape of stories, not the path they took to get there. They heard a claim, saw it repeated, and assumed it had started in a hospital room or a sober family meeting. They could not see the tests, the traps, the long shadow of betrayal that had forced the family into these tactics in the first place. They did not know that some of the most dramatic statements were never meant to describe Elvis's condition at all. They were meant to expose someone else's choice. Inside Graceland, this created a hard tension. On one side, there was the need to protect Elvis from the damage that gossip could cause. On the other, there was the quiet understanding that any striking phrase, once spoken, might one day escape the house and return as a story the family did not recognize. Protection required secrecy. Secrecy sometimes required staged words, and staged words carried their own danger. Vernon carried that conflict with a kind of grim resolve. His trust in the outside world was already thin. Each new leak carved it down a little more. He did not have the luxury of believing that people would simply do the right thing. He had seen too much. He had watched people twist half-heard truths until they barely resembled the moment he had lived through. If he chose to use a dramatic word as a test, it was because he believed the greater threat was not the word itself, but the person who could not keep it. What no one could fully predict was how long one of those words might live once it crossed the line. A test set for a small circle could outlive everyone in it. A single phrase could leave the house riding on a careless conversation, reach an interview, land in a documentary, and eventually settle in the memories of fans as if it had always been there. Time would strip away the context, leaving only the claim. By the time Donna Presley stepped forward to speak plainly, that is what had already happened. The environment Vernon created to catch disloyal lips had also produced something he never intended, a rumor that outlived him, outlived Elvis, and began to shape how people understood those final years. Somewhere along the way, one word had slipped past the gates, found its way into the outside story, and started a new life of its own. The question that now hangs over that history is simple but heavy. When a word that was never meant as truth starts to be treated as fact, who is responsible for pulling it back into the light? Inside the family, there was someone who had watched this process for years, who understood both the fear that created those tests and the damage that one test could do when it escaped. Her decision to finally address that single word would not only challenge the rumor itself. It would force everyone to look again at what really happened inside that house on the hill. Because before anyone could talk about medical reports, prescriptions, or what doctors did and did not say, there had to be an honest look at the rumor's true birthplace. It did not rise out of x-rays or test results. It rose out of a family under siege, a father who trusted almost no one, and a house where even a single word could be loaded like a weapon and fired into the air just to see who would carry the echo. It began the way most dangerous stories begin, not with a press conference or a document, but with a quiet exchange between people who thought they understood one another. In a house where words were sometimes used as traps, there came a moment when someone heard a phrase that was not meant to be literal and carried it as if it were. That is how the ground shifts beneath a family without anyone feeling the earthquake at first. A single sentence leaves the room, attaches itself to emotion, and begins a life of its own somewhere else. Inside Graceland, The idea of using dramatic words to test loyalty had become almost routine. Vernon would share something sharp or alarming with a small circle and then keep watch. If it returned from the outside world dressed up as gossip, he knew who had cracked. Those who lived in that environment understood that a striking claim did not automatically mean crisis. It might simply mean the net had been cast. The trouble came when those on the receiving end did not realize which kind of moment they were in. Some people were naturally cautious. They had learned to let intense remarks settle, to wait and see whether they belonged to the real story or to the private game of tracing leaks. Others did not have that instinct. They held on to every word, especially when it carried fear, and allowed it to become part of how they interpreted everything that followed. A term as heavy as cancer did not float through the air like a neutral idea. It fell into a person's mind and sat there, shaping how they remembered pain, exhaustion, and worry. Around Elvis, there were friends who loved him deeply and tried to navigate this strange world as best they could. One of those figures was Charlie, the man who had been there on stage, backstage, and in the quiet hours when most of the world was asleep. He knew Elvis as a performer and as a person. He saw the tired days, the laughs that came late at night, and the private struggles that never made it past the fence. To him, loyalty was not just a word, it was a way of living. For someone in Charlie's position, the atmosphere around Elvis in those final years was not simple. There were medical issues, real and serious. There were questions about medication, about stress, about how long a body could carry such weight. There were private conversations that sounded bleak. When you stand that close to a man under pressure, you feel every drop of worry, even when no one uses a clinical term. It is easy, in that kind of fog, to reach for an explanation that brings some order to the chaos. At some point along the line, the word that had once been used as part of a loyalty test reached ears that were not thinking like strategists, but like frightened friends. Maybe it came folded inside a story about what someone else had said. Maybe it arrived as a second-hand remark wrapped in concern. However it landed, the effect was the same. The word, cancer, slid from the category of deliberate bait into the category of possible truth. In a world already swirling with worry, it fit too easily. Time moved on. Elvis passed. Grief swept through the people who had known him and through millions who had never met him but felt tied to him in a way they could not explain. In those first months and years, questions came in waves. What exactly had happened to him? How long had he been sick? Could anything have been done differently? Everyone who had been near him carried their own set of memories and impressions. Under the bright, relentless curiosity of the public, they were pressed to explain. This is where the story began to shift from private confusion to public narrative. A man like Charlie, sitting in an interview chair, was not just a friend anymore. He had become a witness. The lights came up, the questions started, and suddenly he was responsible for helping a world in mourning make sense of something that, in truth, had broken even those who were closest to it. With cameras rolling, the urge to give a clear answer could be overwhelming. When someone asked whether Elvis had been living with a serious illness, the old word resurfaced. The half-remembered comment, the dramatic phrase that once belonged to a test, now stepped forward in a new costume. It sounded like it explained things. It sounded like something a doctor might have said. And to a person who felt that Elvis's struggles deserved a label that matched the intensity of what he had endured, it felt almost respectful to give it voice. So the story came out, not as a rumor repeated in a kitchen, but as a statement offered in what looked like a formal setting. It was not tossed out like gossip. It was spoken with sorrow, with the weight of a man who believed he was sharing something serious. That gave it power. Viewers watching did not see the years of testing and traps behind the scenes. They only saw a close friend, eyes heavy with memory, saying that cancer had spread through Elvis's body. From there, the path was predictable. Once a phrase like that appears in an interview or a documentary, it does what such phrases always do. It detaches from context and attaches itself to print. Writers quote it. Other interviewers repeat it back as if it were already accepted fact and ask others to confirm or deny. Slowly, the tone shifts. What began as "someone once said" becomes "as is well known," even though nothing of the sort had ever been confirmed by medical records or by the family itself. It did not take long for fans around the world to pick up the thread. Many of them heard the claim not from its original source, but from the second or third echo. They read that Elvis had suffered from bone cancer in the final stretch of his life. They saw it stated alongside other details that were accurate. In that mix, the false and the true stood shoulder to shoulder, and most people had no way to separate them. The more often they encountered that line, the more solid it became in their minds. Meanwhile, the very people whose reality contradicted that claim watched the rumor grow from a distance. They knew what his doctors had and had not said. They knew what his medical examinations had shown. They had seen the record themselves. There was no cancer. Yet outside, the story began to harden. It spread through fan conversations, online comments, and biographies that did not always check their sources as carefully as they should have. The house on the hill had lost control over a word it had never embraced as truth in the first place. The strange part is that the rumor did not spread because people wanted to damage Elvis. In many cases, they believed they were defending him. The idea of bone cancer gave his decline a kind of tragic nobility that people understood. It softened some of the harder questions about lifestyle, pressure, and the medical choices that had been made. To say he had been fighting cancer allowed people to frame him as a victim of something no one could prevent, rather than a man caught in a knot of pain, exhaustion, and dependence on medication that the world did not yet fully know how to talk about. While the public held on to this version, the medical reality sat quietly on the other side of the fence. If Elvis had truly lived with advanced bone cancer, everything around him would have looked very different. There would have been specific treatments, a certain kind of pain management, a pattern to his care that simply was not there. His ability to keep traveling, to perform, to move through his demanding schedule would have broken down in a way that leaves a clear trace. That pattern never appeared. Yet in the early years of the rumor's life, those contradictions rarely reached the same audience that had heard the original claim. The drama of a fatal illness made for a compelling explanation, and compelling explanations have a way of drowning out quieter corrections. In interviews, book chapters, and late-night conversations among fans, the story of Elvis and bone cancer gained weight through repetition alone. The more people believed it, the harder it became to challenge without sounding harsh or dismissive of grief. Inside the family, this created a painful tension. They had to live with the knowledge that a word once used in a carefully controlled way inside Graceland now defined how strangers imagined Elvis's last chapter. They knew that this was never their reality. They had not sat around kitchen tables talking about cancer spreading through his body. They had not heard doctors deliver that verdict. Yet every year, the rumor spread farther, crossing into new generations of fans who had not been alive when Elvis died, but felt certain they knew what had happened to him. By the time Donna Presley chose to step forward and make her statement, the story she was addressing was not a minor misunderstanding. It had become, in many minds, part of the official narrative. She was not simply correcting a misquote. She was standing against years of repeated claims, interviews, and documentaries that had treated the rumor as fact. The path from a single dramatic word used in a moment of strategy to a widely accepted belief about Elvis's death had taken decades, and she was now walking back along that path in public. What makes this journey so unsettling is how ordinary each step seemed as it happened. A private test in a house worried about betrayal, a concerned friend repeating something he had heard and believed, an interviewer asking for clarity, a documentary repeating a striking line, fans passing the story along with the sincere belief that they were sharing truth. No one step looks like the birth of a lie that will last for generations. Yet when you line them up, you can see how a word that never belonged to the medical record found its way into the legend. By the time the truth began to speak with the same calm certainty that rumor had enjoyed for years, the roles were almost reversed. The correction felt new and surprising, while the false story felt established and familiar. That is the power of repetition. It can make any idea feel solid, even when it has no real foundation. It can make a rumor feel like history and turn actual history into something that sounds like an argument. In the end, the most striking part of this unraveling is not the fact that a rumor spread. Rumors always spread around people as famous as Elvis. The striking part is how long this one survived without anyone putting it next to the simple facts of his medical care and asking whether it actually fit. The world accepted a word that had once been spoken inside a very specific kind of conversation and forgot to ask where it had come from. By the time someone finally stood up and pointed back toward the real record, the story had already dug deep roots into the way people imagined his final years. For many people, the bone cancer story did something they did not even realize they needed. It took something chaotic and frightening and wrapped it in a single, powerful word. Cancer sounded like a plan, like a narrative the mind already understood. People could imagine the diagnosis, the slow decline, the hidden suffering. It made them feel that what happened to Elvis followed a path they had seen before, even if only in other families or in films. That feeling brought a strange kind of comfort. Grief often searches for reasons that feel big enough to match the loss. Elvis was not a small presence in anyone's life. He carried entire eras on his shoulders. He changed music, style, and even the way fame looked. When a person like that dies, the heart struggles to accept an answer that feels ordinary. The idea that his body simply could not carry the strain any longer, that exhaustion, pain, and years of pressure finally met in one tragic point, does not always feel like enough. People reach for a cause that sounds worthy of him. Bone cancer fit that need. It sounded brutal, heroic, and final. Fans could picture him fighting through shows despite unbearable pain, standing under the lights while a secret battle raged inside his body. That picture allowed them to hold on to him as a warrior taken by an enemy no one could defeat. In that version, blame becomes easier to place. Fate becomes the villain, not decisions, not systems, not the slow neglect of a man's humanity in the face of his image. At the same time, the truth about his final years did not slip away. It waited in medical files, in the memories of his doctors, and in the recollections of family members who had watched him closely. They saw the real pattern. They knew which medications he had been given and why. They remembered the specialists who had examined him, the tests that had been run, the conversations that took place after his passing when opinions were weighed and records were reviewed. Cancer did not appear in those meetings. It did not appear in those reports. The gap between what fans believed and what the family knew grew wider with every year. On one side, there were people who loved Elvis and clung to a story that helped them live with the shock of losing him. On the other, there was a family who had lived through the nights of worry, who had felt the strain in the air, and who understood that his struggle had been real but different. They had watched him deal with chronic pain, with insomnia, with the physical toll of constant travel and performance. They had seen the way medication entered that picture and refused to leave. There is a certain cruelty in the truth. It says that a man can be broken slowly by a life that asks too much of him for too long. It says that bodies do not always fail under a single clear label. Sometimes they give way under the weight of many pressures stacked on top of one another. That is harder to turn into a clean story. It asks people to look not just at fate, but at choices, expectations, and the way the world treats its brightest lights when it wants more from them than they can give. Donna Presley stepped into this divide with a calm that did not come from distance, but from having carried this tension for years. She had listened as the rumor grew stronger. She had watched interviews and documentaries repeat the cancer story as if it had always been part of the record. She understood why people held on to it. Yet she also knew that if no one in the family spoke plainly, that version would harden into something that looked like history instead of what it really was. A story born of confusion and repeated without proof. When she finally sat down to address it, she did not raise her voice. She did not speak with anger. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She removed the drama and replaced it with clarity. She said that no one in the family had ever heard anything about Elvis having bone cancer. Not in private, not from doctors, not even in the painful aftermath of his death when everything had been examined. She stated it as a simple fact because that is what it was. Then she went further. She did not stop at saying what had not happened. She explained why the rumor had always been out of step with the medical reality. If Elvis had lived with advanced bone cancer, his care would have followed a very specific path. He would have been placed on certain drugs that are used mainly to manage that kind of pain. His ability to move, travel, and perform in the way he did would have collapsed in a pattern that cancer specialists know by heart. That pattern was missing from his life. The prescriptions he received did not match it. The way he moved through those last years did not match it. By spelling this out, she did something the rumor had never done. She connected the claim to the actual details of his treatment and showed how the pieces refused to fit. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a quiet dismantling. Each point stripped away one layer of false certainty. What remained was not a new conspiracy or an even darker story. What remained was the uncomfortable truth that his final years were shaped by issues people still struggle to talk about openly. Dependence on medication, unmanaged pain, relentless pressure, and the limits of a man who had long been treated as if he had none. Listening to her, you can almost feel the weight of that honesty. It does not offer an excuse. It does not let anyone step back and say, nothing could have been done. Instead, it forces a harder reflection. It asks people to consider how fame isolates a person. It asks them to think about a system that kept pushing him forward when rest might have saved him. It asks them to look at a culture that reaches for pills instead of solutions, for quick relief instead of real change. None of those questions are easy. They do not fit neatly into a headline. That is why the cancer story felt safer. It allowed people to grieve without examining the world that helped create the pressure cooker he lived in. It allowed them to picture him as a victim of something entirely beyond human influence. In that version, the industry, the expectations, the demands placed on his body and mind fade into the background. The problem becomes invisible, lodged only inside his bones, and not in the way people around him handled his pain. Donna did not call anyone a liar. She knew that some of the people who repeated the bone cancer story had done so with sincere hearts. They believed they were honoring him, sharing what they thought was a hidden truth. She spoke of Charlie with respect, acknowledging his kindness and loyalty. In her eyes, his words were not an attack. They were a reflection of a misunderstanding born in a strange world where dramatic statements were sometimes used to catch disloyalty, and where not everyone had been told which words belonged to that game. The fallout of the rumor, though, reached beyond any individual. It shaped how millions saw Elvis's final chapter. It painted him as a man carrying a secret diagnosis, rather than a man trying to stand upright under a different kind of weight. It shifted attention away from the systems that failed him and toward an illness he never had. That shift matters. When people misread the cause of a tragedy, they misjudge what might be learned from it. In her statement, Donna took on that responsibility. She placed the focus back where it belonged. She reminded people that the real story was not about a hidden cancer, but about a human being whose body and spirit had been pushed too far. She spoke about medication tied to known conditions, not to a terminal disease. She spoke about exhaustion, chronic pain, and the mental and physical burden he carried. In doing so, she asked fans to love Elvis not as a mythic figure with a tragic secret illness, but as a man whose vulnerabilities deserve to be seen clearly. For some listeners, this clarity came as a relief. It freed them from a story that had never quite sat right in their minds. They could finally let go of the image of bone cancer and replace it with the real, if more complicated, picture. Others struggled. The new information did not match what they had believed for years. It pressed them to reconsider documentaries they had watched and interviews they had trusted. It forced them to decide whether their loyalty to Elvis meant holding on to the story they preferred or accepting the truth his own family was offering. That choice is where the emotional heart of the fallout lives. The rumor had asked almost nothing of anyone. It allowed people to mourn and move on, convinced that fate had written the ending. The truth asks for more. It asks fans to stand in a place that is less comfortable but more honest. It invites them to see that loving him means respecting the reality of his struggles, even if that reality reflects badly on the way the world treated him. In the middle of all this, one thing becomes clear. Donna's decision to speak was not about defending a reputation in the shallow sense. It was about restoring the dignity of someone she loved. She refused to let his story be defined by a word that had never belonged to him. She refused to allow his pain to be rearranged into a narrative that erased the real pressures he faced. Her calm correction was, in its own way, an act of loyalty as strong as any taken in the years when he was still alive. As the truth she shared continues to spread, it forces a reckoning. People who once repeated the cancer rumor now have to decide what they will say the next time the topic comes up. Fans who encounter the story for the first time must choose which version they will believe. Writers and filmmakers who had treated the rumor as fact faced the task of going back, revisiting their work, and perhaps admitting that they had leaned too much on a line that sounded powerful but lacked support. The cost of this is not just embarrassment, it is emotional. Letting go of a story that has comforted you can feel like losing the person all over again. Yet there is also a quieter gift inside that loss. When the myth falls away, what remains is a clearer view of Elvis as he truly was in those last years: talented, burdened, loved, and human. Not a patient in a secret war against cancer, but a man worn down by forces both inside and outside him. By the end of Donna's explanation, one truth stands above the rest. The world had been willing to accept a rumor because it was easy. She is asking it now to do something harder. She is asking it to honor Elvis by facing the real story of his final years, not the softer version that grew out of confusion and repeated itself into legend. In that request lies the deepest consequence of the cancer myth. It did not just distort the facts. It delayed the moment when everyone would finally have to look at what really happened and decide what they were going to learn from it. By the time Donna chose to speak, Elvis's story had already passed through more hands than any one person could count. Biographers, interviewers, distant acquaintances, and people who had never walked through the gates of Graceland all felt entitled to add a line. Some did it with care, others did it with confidence that outran their knowledge. The result was a legacy split into two tracks. There was the man his family remembered, and there was the figure the public had assembled out of rumor, fragments, and repetition. Her decision to address the bone cancer story did not come from a desire to win an argument on the internet. It came from the quieter, heavier place where family memory lives. She had watched her uncle's name pulled in every direction. She had listened to people describe experiences he had never had and illnesses he had never faced. She carried not just grief, but the responsibility that comes from being one of the few who can still say, "I was there. I know what did and did not happen." When she looked at how the cancer rumor had settled into his legacy, she saw something deeper than a factual mistake. She saw how easy it was for the world to accept a version of Elvis that made everyone else feel more comfortable. A tragic, untreatable disease removed the need to ask hard questions. It made his decline feel like destiny instead of the result of human choices, pressures, and failures. It allowed history to move on without learning much from him. By pulling that single word out of the story, she was doing more than correcting medical details. She was forcing everyone to look again at the man behind the myth, a person who had not been quietly walking through a textbook illness, but someone trying to survive under an invisible weight. A son, a father, a cousin, a friend, whose last years were not scripted by a diagnosis, but by 1,000 small decisions made in dressing rooms, offices, and late-night conversations. That picture is less neat. It is also more real. The twist, if there is one, is that the truth makes Elvis's endurance look even more remarkable and even more heartbreaking. If he had lived with terminal bone cancer, people would see his performances as the bravest final act of a man who knew his time was short. When you accept Donna's account, you see something different. You see a man who did not believe he was living inside a countdown, but who still stepped on stage while carrying exhaustion, pain, and a body pushed beyond its limits. He was not playing out a known ending. He was trying to keep going. That realization changes the emotional temperature of his legacy. It moves him away from the familiar image of the doomed hero and towards something more fragile and human. It invites people to understand that he was not only a symbol of success, but also an example of what happens when the world does not know how to say enough to someone it constantly demands more from. It challenges fans to admire not just his triumphs, but his vulnerability and to see the cost of a life lived under relentless expectation. For future generations who will meet Elvis only through recordings and stories, the difference matters. If they inherit a legend built on false illness, they learn to see him as a distant figure shaped mainly by fate. If they inherit the truth, they are offered something else. They see a man whose heart and body were worn down by real pressures that still exist today. They might ask better questions about how we treat artists, how we handle pain, and how fame can hide suffering instead of healing it. Donna's statement also shines a light back on Vernon Presley, a man who has often been frozen in the public imagination as stern, guarded, even hard. When you understand the environment he lived in, his actions take on a different color. The loyalty tests, the dramatic words used as bait, were not the moves of a man playing games with his son's life. They were the decisions of a father who believed he was living in a siege, trying to keep something precious from being torn apart by gossip. His methods had consequences, but they were born from fear, not cruelty. In that sense, the bone cancer rumor becomes a symbol of how even protective instincts can produce unintended harm. A word chosen to expose betrayal ended up shaping the story told about Elvis for decades. That does not make Vernon a villain. It makes him human, struggling to manage a situation no parent is prepared for. Donna's calm explanation does not excuse the damage, but it places it in context. It reminds people that behind the mythic surname there were real people, making imperfect decisions under unimaginable pressure. The legacy that emerges from this clearer view is far more complex than the old rumor allowed. Elvis is not the tragic patient whose fate was sealed by an unseen disease. He is the exhausted performer still trying to deliver, the son whose father never stopped fearing for him, the man whose family now feels compelled to guard his story from being overwritten by convenience. His battles were not tidy. They did not end with a simple label. They unfolded in the messy overlap between fame, medicine, family, and the expectations of millions. For fans who truly love him, this complexity is not an insult. It is a gift. It invites them closer. It allows them to see the courage it took to keep walking on stage when his body and mind were under strain. It lets them honor the reality that his life did not break along a clean, cinematic arc, but in the quiet, uneven way that real lives do. It asks them to stand with him in that reality, rather than hiding behind a story that feels smoother but is less true. There is also a lesson here about how we hold the stories of those we admire. It is easy to treat myths as tributes. It is harder to admit that over time, they can become cages. A rumor like bone cancer traps Elvis in a version of himself that he never lived. It reduces his final chapter to a narrative that makes sense to observers but does not match the experience of those who walked beside him. When Donna insists on the truth, she is breaking that cage open, even if it means some people will resist at first. Her voice, steady and measured, adds a new layer to his legacy, the legacy of a family member brave enough to correct the record when it would have been simpler to stay silent. In doing so, she offers an example to anyone who finds their loved one's memory shaped by stories that do not ring true. She shows that loyalty is not just about protecting someone from criticism. It is also about protecting them from being turned into someone they were not. As people listen to her and begin to adjust their understanding, the way they talk about Elvis will inevitably shift. Some will still cling to the old story, many will not. Over time, the hope is that the truth she has laid out will become the foundation future accounts build upon. That historians, documentarians, and fans will treat her words not as one opinion among many, but as a key piece of the record. If that happens, then one of the most enduring rumors of his life will finally begin to loosen its grip on his legacy. When that day comes, Elvis will stand in the public imagination not as a man secretly consumed by cancer, but as someone who did his best in a body and a life pushed to their limits. The conversation around him can then move away from false diagnoses and toward more meaningful questions. How did the industry use him? How did the people around him fail him and support him? How can future artists be protected from similar fates? Those are the questions that honor him far more than clinging to a story that never belonged to his truth. In the end, that is what Donna is asking the world to do, to love him enough to let go of comforting fiction, to care enough to accept a harder story, to see that the highest form of respect is not to make his life sound simple, but to face its complexity with honesty. When fans choose that path, they do more than clear up a rumor. They step into the same act of protection she has taken on, guarding his memory from being bent into shapes that make everyone else feel better at his expense. Because Elvis Presley does not need a false illness to make his life feel significant, he does not need invented tragedy to deepen the impact of his music or the weight of his presence. What he needs, and what his family continues to fight for, is simple. He needs the truth, the truth of what he carried, what he faced, and how the world chose to respond. Accepting that truth is not just a correction. It is a final, quiet act of love for the man behind the legend. If you have ever felt caught between the myths and the man, take a moment to sit with this story and decide what you believe truly honors him. And if you want more stories that look beyond rumors and listen to the people who were there, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below.